just on your perspective on climate change action and the barrier to that. Just to let you see that, but we will move on quickly now. We were hoping to get that started a little bit earlier. Sorry for not starting so promptly. So with no further ado, a quick introduction to CAT itself. For those who don't know, CAT was established as an off-grid community in response to the 1970s oil crisis in a disused slate quarry in Wales, and was all about experimenting with renewable energy technologies, regenerating the biodiversity and soil of the quarry, and has evolved over time into an educational charity still based in the same quarry, but now with nearly 50 years of transformational leadership in sustainability and spinning out innovation. For nearly 15 years, CAT has done zero carbon Britain research, most recently publishing in 2019. And that has shown how we could provide ourselves with enough energy to live healthy, happy, comfortable and connected lives at net zero using only existing and low risk renewable technology. The reports from that work are all available free on our website, cat.org.uk. And our Hub and Innovation Lab project is now building on that research to support action on climate emergency declarations. And we'll tell you a bit more about that at the end of the webinar. As I said, I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Professor Kevin Anderson to you. He's an ex-colleague of mine from the University of Manchester and was a big influence on my decision to get involved in the Zero Carbon Britain project to limit rather than adapt to climate change. And his dedication to really walking the talk is very inspirational. He's Professor of Energy and Climate Change at the Universities of Manchester, Uppsala in Sweden and Bergen in Norway. He's active in research with high-profile publications in climate policy, nature and science. More practically, he's got a decade's industrial experience in the petrochemical industry. He's a chartered engineer and a fellow of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers. He's also a regular guest lecturer with CAT's Graduate School of the Environment. So with no further ado, I'll hand you over to Kevin and we'll hear what he's got to say.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Hopefully, can you see put your thumbs up if you can see my screen? That's great. All right, I'll take all the visions off. Well, yeah, thank you very much for that introduction. The talk I'm going to give tonight, actually, I've changed it a little bit this afternoon. So I was involved in an event at the House of Commons today, a virtual event with David King, the old chief scientist that some of you are slightly older, a bit more my age may remember. David King and a few others actually. And it was about the CEE bill, the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill. And it was they're trying to get more and more MPs signed up to it. I think they've got about 100 so far. And that bill focuses much more on 1.5 degrees centigrade. So actually I'm going to use some of that thinking from that discussion today to inform some of the slides this evening. So I've called this Getting Off a Moving Train. And I think the train is now going fairly fast. It set off. Well, it probably set off a long time ago, maybe in 1870, but certainly we knew it was starting to move quite rapidly from 1990 onwards with the first IPCC report, and now we're going really at a ridiculously fast level. And it's going to be very difficult to get off this train, but I'm going to try and think about that, in how we can do that in this presentation. I'm going to focus here much more on 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming rather than 2 degrees centigrade. And that's because of really the climate communique that came out a little while ago from G7, and that's also the focus of the CEE bill. If people want to discuss later the viability of 1.5, perhaps we can do that in the Q&A. But I'm going to start off with just a bit of science, and probably don't need to say too much to the audience attending a CAT event, but the climate does not respond to good intentions, to Machiavellian policies, to eloquent arguments, legal nicences, or indeed accountancy scams. It responds only to the brutal beauty of the physics. And that tells us actually what really matters is the total amount of carbon dioxide that we put in the atmosphere, along with other greenhouse gases. And these relate to temperature and indeed to impacts. So that's the bit of science over and done with. Now, in 2008, the UK passed the UK Parliament passed the Climate Change Act, which in my view was then, and in some respects still is, the leading piece of legislation of any nation on climate change. I think it's a really excellent act. It certainly was in 2008. And even today, it's better than the recent 2019 Swedish climate change legislation. So it still leads many countries in the world. But in 2021, is it still really fit for purpose? In 2009, the year after the act, there's the quite famous paper that came out in Nature from Rockström and Steffen, and really often probably more commonly known as the Planetary Boundaries paper. And that sort of set up the sort of set of ecological challenges that we were facing and failing on pretty much across the board, actually. So that was an important sort of shift, I think, after 2008 in the Act. Then we had the first IPCC report that included the concept of carbon budgets. That was the AR5 in 2014. So the carbon budget concept came out of that. We had the really important Paris Agreement at the end of 2015, almost in 2016. That was the focus then on 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade. And the 1.5 was the first time that had really come out in any major negotiations, and was quite a significant shift from what many of us thought was going to be the outcome of Paris. So 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade. And then on the back of Paris, the sort of policymakers asked the scientists to look at, well, what are the impacts of 1.5 compared with 2? And the SR 1.5 report came out in 2018 and demonstrated actually the impacts of 1.5, though they were very severe still, were significantly less than those at 2 degrees centigrade. And I think that was really important in making us understand that just half a degree in warming actually has a big impact in terms of the scale and severity of impacts. And I think that really, in my view, seemed to be certainly one of the catalysts that led into the climate emergencies, the declarations there. And we've got, whether it's here in Scotland or Northern Ireland, or indeed, as it demonstrates this slip here from the paper in Wales, but of course in the UK, the EU, and more widely as well, this sort of whole language of climate emergency came to the fore. That was changing the tenor of the debate. At least that was the hope really behind that. And I think in some respects it did. We had in May of this year, we had the G7 meeting, which actually, to its credit, was actually a virtual meeting of environment ministers, and it came out with the G7 climate communique, which is an important document in that it reinforced the focus on 1.5 degrees centigrade. So rather than the sort of 1.5 to 2, where most people, including myself, sort of thought the focus was much more on the 2 in that, this sort of tried to draw it back to the 1.5. And I think this came out of this whole sort of series of events that had led up to it, including, of course, importantly, the SR 1.5 report, which has outlined all of the impacts. And then in 2021, we had, this year again, we had the latest AR6 report that lays out the sort of physical basis of climate change and the latest round of carbon budgets. And that's been important again in sort of colouring some of the discussion as we go into COP26 in Glasgow. But whilst all of this has gone on, we've heard sort of repeatedly in the UK that we're showing leadership. And indeed, you hear this almost every country you go to, most towns and cities, no doubt, or companies and universities. We all claim that we're the ones showing leadership, yet oddly enough, global emissions continue to rise. So if we look at the UK, we had the net zero report, and now we've got the 6th carbon budget report, actually, both of those actually in law, though, as is pointed out by the CCC, it looks like we're going to fail to meet our 4th and 5th carbon budgets, let alone our 6th. But the CCC emphasised in the 6th budget report that emissions in 2020 were 51% lower than they were in 1990. And this is the sort of language we often hear from the so-called climate progressive countries. And yet, if you include emissions from international aviation and shipping, and indeed our emissions associated with our imports and our exports, then what we see is, I would argue, really very little leadership. We see a reduction of about 15% compared with 1990. So that's about 0.5% every single year. And that's true of, well, in fact, that's actually slightly better than Denmark, Sweden, and France, or indeed the EU. But it's true of other climate progressive countries as well. When you actually look at the full carbon footprint of living within those countries, then actually there's been very little reduction since 1990. And quite a few countries have actually had a significant increase. And it's also probably worth just noting that the reduction we have seen really has occurred probably after 2007, 2008. So there was the banking crisis then that led on to the sort of really about a decade or more of austerity. So that was a key part. If you look at the emission curves of virtually all industrialized countries, you'll see a significant shift in the shape of those curves after the banking crisis. Austerity and its impact on growth has been absolutely key in changing the emissions pathways. It is also true in the UK that we did cut back on coal significantly, coal-fired power generation. That was driven primarily by the EU legislation in 2000 on sulfur, but also to a degree by the carbon floor price. But I think it'd be fair to say we haven't had a really strong set of climate policies that have driven what we've seen so far. And I think the government's own oil and gas authority, which is an executive agency of BEIS, so it's a government department or agency, that if you look at their opening statement on their webpage or indeed on their Twitter account, it sort of gives lie to the appropriateness or the inappropriateness of net zero, where it states that we work with the industry and government to maximize the economic recovery of oil and gas and support the UK government in its drive to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Now, most people will say these are completely incompatible statements, and yet we still have that as the principal lead from the Oil and Gas Authority. And if you look at statements from various ministers, they say pretty much the same thing, that we can have as much transport as we want and just deal with it with technology. I mean, it's across the board. We're going to be able to resolve these issues just with technology. And if you play out the Oil and Gas Authority's sort of statement, well, it is delivering change, physical change and infrastructure. Here we have the Clare Ridge platform phase 2, which have got the go-ahead. That's about 250 million tons of CO2. We've got the new Glengorm gas, well, it was new 2 years ago now, Glengorm gas discovery in the North Sea. That's about another 100 million tons of CO2. We've got the development near Hull and in East Yorkshire. That's about 13 million tons of carbon dioxide. And I think very significantly, though often, seldom touched by the press actually, the UK government through its export finance agency is spending about £1 billion of taxpayers' money as a guarantor on a huge LNG facility in Mozambique. And it's not for the Mozambicans, it's actually for export, including already contracts with Centrica. That's about 4 billion tons of carbon dioxide. And that, I think that lie about the appropriateness of net zero is also evident when you look at the ongoing expansion of airports in the UK. Bristol Airport and the inquiries out at the moment deciding on that. Stansted's got the go ahead. I think Leeds they're fairly confident Leeds are going to get the go ahead. So we're seeing a suite of airports putting forward their proposals. Some of them already getting the go ahead. We've got £27 billion been earmarked for new roads, not actually in Wales. I think to the credit of the Welsh government, they seem to have stepped back from that. The potential opening of a new coal mine. In the year of COP in 2021, with all the evidence we have, we're still actually seriously considering opening a new coal mine. Significant enthusiasm for the Cambo oil field, just west of Shetland, with again a significant quantity of oil and therefore carbon dioxide locked into that. And in isolation, all of these carbon profligate developments are actually compatible with net zero. It's a really dangerous framing because it does not stop the development of any fossil fuel facility in isolation. And there is no sort of collective approach as to whether they fit or not, because we are allowed a lot of flexibility in the carbon budgets and the short-term carbon budgets and the net zero framing that is currently in legislation. So our response to the climate emergency has been no sweeping and rapid social change, which we did see, of course, in relation to the banking crisis and later in relation to COVID. No immediate and widespread penetration of low carbon technologies. So we're not seeing those spread out anything like the sort of speed we've seen other responses to emergencies. What we have seen is some more renewables, but those renewables are plus oil, gas, and coal, not instead of. We've seen some EVs being sold, but they're being sold in addition to petrol and diesel. And actually the sales of SUV cars in the UK, indeed across Europe, is much faster than it is for EVs. So the EVs are not even meant to usurp these high carbon vehicles that we're selling. And we've seen significant improvements in efficiency, but that's gone along with more consumption, this sort of old Jevons paradox, because there's no policy framework to stop that. So all of these things actually make the situation significantly worse. Net zero by 2050 broadly supports incremental adjustments to business as usual. And I would argue that actually that's what it was intended to do. It was intended to bring the policymakers along, push them as hard as we could, but within that business as usual framing. So in some respects, it's done its job. But of course, what it hasn't done is respond to the challenges that are laid down in the Paris Agreement. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. So what does the IPCC tell us about Paris, and indeed about the G7, the more significant ramping up of the ambition to 1.5 degrees centigrade? Well, if we look at the AR5, the SR 1.5, and the latest AR6 reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in terms of mitigation, it's been very clear that the key issue here is the total carbon budget rather than any sort of long-term targets. And it's this carbon budget, the total, that links with temperature rise. So not necessarily the short-term sort of 5-year budgets we have in the UK, which are not linked to a total carbon budget for the UK anymore. And I say I will touch on that in a minute. But it's the total global carbon budget that links to temperatures. And just for those that aren't familiar with this, it's the area under the curve in this little plot here. So if indeed we do expand Bristol Airport and Stansted Airport, then it will require future generations to to mitigate still further or remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to compensate for the ongoing levels of emissions. And I'll try to demonstrate that that really is not going to be possible. So if we took the latest AR6 report, so this is the one that just came out very recently. Now the SPM, the Summary for Policymaker documents, is available. The full science report is available, but it's not yet complete, a citable form. So if we take the headline carbon budgets from AR6, what we get from that is that if we want to stay somewhere around the 1.5 degree C framing, if we want a good chance of staying within 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming, bearing in mind that that level of warming is already it will be pretty dangerous for many people around the planet. So it is not as if it comes without a set of impacts. We're seeing significant impacts already from about just over 1 degree centigrade of warming. So 1.5 is set, if you look at the SR 1.5 report, set to bring about a whole series of additional impacts. If you think of it from an emblematic ecosystem point of view, about 3/4 of the barrier reef will be dead at 1.5. And at 2 degrees centigrade, we pretty much wipe it all out. And obviously, it's not just due to climate change, it's due to other pollutants and so forth as well. But the climate is a significant factor. So even at 1.5, we're seeing significant ecological impacts. But for a good chance of staying below 1.5, then we only have a carbon budget of about 400 billion tons. And if we're prepared to accept a lower chance of 1.5, then that increases the budget. So we're up to 650 billion tons. But notice these numbers are from 2020, not from today. And so if you adjust those numbers to say January 2022, so just a few months from now, and I'm focusing in here on energy only carbon dioxide, and I will acknowledge that the agricultural emissions from agriculture, particularly land use emissions, but particularly from agriculture, are a significant part of our warming. Somewhere between 20 to 25% of the warming we see today is from the emissions from agriculture, principally methane and nitrous oxide emissions. They are important and they can be significantly reduced. They cannot be eliminated. It's not my area of expertise. I've got colleagues that work in those areas. So I'm not going to focus on those now, but I just want to recognize they are important. But the principal reason we're seeing the warming is because of the carbon dioxide from our ongoing use of fossil fuels. And that's what I'm going to focus on here. So for a likely chance of 1.5 degrees centigrade, our global carbon budget is somewhere between, say, 220 and 470 billion tons of carbon dioxide from the start of 2022 out to the end of the century and indeed beyond. Now, it could be a bit more than that, it could be a bit less than that. I'm trying to give a sort of range there that captures that likely to unlikely chance of 1.5. In 2019, emissions were about 36 billion tons, 36.4, I think. And they're probably going to be very similar, down maybe 0.1, 0.2 of a gigaton in 2020 and 2021. They obviously dropped significantly in 2020 by about 6 to 7% globally and about 10 to 11% within the UK. But this year they bounced back to almost their 2019 levels. That's what we think will happen. If you play that out, that's 6 to 13 years of current global emissions before we take out the budget for 1.5 degrees centigrade. 6 to 13 years, so it's incredibly rapid. And I think that's actually quite useful. That's if it was held constant. But if instead we were serious about climate change and we immediately start to reduce our emissions, you can see on this simple stylized plot here, if we started from 2022, then for a likely chance of 1.5, we would have till about 2036. That's roughly when we'd need to be zero emissions from our energy system, 2036 at a global level. Now, if we were prepared to accept a much lower chance of 1.5, so an unlikely chance of 1.5, that gives us that bigger budget. And that allows us to play out probably to something like 2048 at a global level. That's if we start reducing emissions immediately. So stylistically, I think these give a sense of the scale of that challenge. Either way, it's going to be huge. I mean, these are reductions way above those that we would traditionally get to think about. We also have to remember these are global reductions. And we in the Paris Agreement, and indeed every agreement since the UNFCCC met in convention in 1992, we've had a focus on equity particularly between the wealthy and the poorer parts of the world. So common but differentiated responsibility is the awful expression that is used. So basically, the richer part of the world need to reduce emissions more rapidly than in the poorer part of the world to give them a little bit more chance to use fossil fuels to help them improve their quality of life. So we have to think about that when we consider if we're going to stay within 1.5. We've got this global carbon pie, which you can see here represented simply as a large pie with emissions from 220 to 470 billion tons for 1.5 degrees centigrade. Now the question we have to ask is, how much should the UK get if we're going to divide this pie up? I mean, what's a fair way to divide it for the UK? Now, we did quite a lot of work on this in a paper last year. So what I'm doing today is really using the work from that paper and adjusting it slightly for 1.5, because our previous analysis was for 2 degrees centigrade. So the numbers here are still very, very provisional. But in doing this, we did actually take took into serious account this equity dimension within our international negotiations. So we looked first at what the poor parts of the world would need to allow them to carry on with some sort of reasonable improvement in their quality of life. And then we sort of looked at, well, how much of that budget, that the carbon budget, is then left for the wealthier parts of the world. And that was quite an iterative process doing that. And then we've said, well, how do we divide that other part for the wealthy parts between the different countries like the US, Japan, the UK, other countries in the EU, and so forth. And we tried a range of techniques for doing that. But however you play it out, the UK gets a very small slice, as indeed does every wealthy part of the world. So for the UK, for 1.5 degrees centigrade, and as I've noted here on the slide, these numbers are very provisional. We would have somewhere between 0.75 and 2.5 billion tons of CO2. That would be our sort of fair contribution to a global effort to try and stay within 1.5. And obviously the smaller number there is a better chance of 1.5, and the large number a lower chance. That may mean very little to most of you, but our emissions at the moment, including aviation and shipping, are probably somewhere just a little under 400 million tons of carbon dioxide. So that will tell you we're talking about very approximately 2 to 6 years of current emissions before we take out our fair part of the budget. And if you think about, if we then just do, again, just the stylized straight line coming down, that would give us up to 12 years for a low chance of 1.5 and only 4 years for a good chance of 1.5. So it demonstrates how hugely challenging the 1.5 degrees C framing actually is. And I think that's an important part for the committee for the climate and ecological emergency bill that's people are trying to get through the House of Commons, is that it really does change the agenda much more than the 2 degrees C framing that we had before. So really, at these sorts of rates, the argument I would make is that we need to treat this like the emergency it is. And just to give a sort of a flavor of 1.5 degrees C mitigation, from energy, that means we would need about an 80% reduction by 2030, depending on exactly when we started to bring emissions down. But we would need to start ideally immediately and then ramp up the rate of reduction each year very quickly. And that's compared with 2019, not compared with 1990, which is more commonly used. And that makes it far more onerous than say the current set of carbon budgets that we're working under. That's zero carbon energy by about 2035. And actually for 1.5 degrees centigrade, it's, that's about as late as it could possibly be. But when I say zero carbon energy, that's across all realms, from aviation and shipping to industry, our homes, our public transport, our cars, and so forth. And it's real zero, not net zero. That's immediate and profound system change. This is a challenge way above anything yet we're prepared to countenance on climate change. It's really like an ongoing year-on-year sort of shift in our economies and how we live our lives. Not dissimilar to some of the changes we saw initially with banking and then with COVID. Why is this so different to net zero? Well, Well, net zero is first, it's not based on the total carbon budget concept anymore. It's actually based on what we need to do by 2050, or as I prefer to see it, not in my term of office. But also it's focused on what's called highest possible ambition, which is a very nebulous term, and that can mean almost anything. There's no quantitative framework behind the UK's net zero framing, or indeed behind the carbon budgets, because they are just intended to meet net zero by 2050. They also are deeply reliant on carbon dioxide removal, so negative emission technologies and other so-called nature-based solutions that are going to be supposedly applied and deployed at scale, at huge scale, by our children and our children's children, to remove significant quantities of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Just to give a flavour of it, if you ramped up the Committee on Climate Change's negative emission technologies in its spreadsheet out to 2050, then beyond 2050, it looks like they're implying about 10 billion tons rather of negative emissions year on year prorated. Now that's roughly the same as the net absorption by photosynthesis around the planet at the moment. So it's a huge shift, which is assumed to operate in all of the models. My view on this is, yes, let's fund significant R&D into negative emissions and nature-based solutions and so forth. And if they do meet stringent sustainability criteria, and that's a big if they can, let's deploy them. But let's reduce our emissions today, assuming they won't work at scale. And actually, I think we need to do that in relation to energy, because we're going to need some form of carbon dioxide removal to compensate for the ongoing warming from the residual greenhouse gases from agriculture that I touched on before, from methane and nitrous oxide. And these will be quite significant, and maybe as much as sort of 6 to 10 billion tons of CO2 equivalent year on year, just from feeding, say, 7.8 to 9 billion people. So as a consequence of that, we actually need real zero in our energy system. And if you look at the net zero framing, it's nothing like the 1.5 to 2 degrees C that we're committed to. If you actually play out the numbers from the net zero framing at a sort of global level, it's probably nearer 2.5 to 3 degrees centigrade of warming. So a huge shift from actually what we are committed to deliver. So what I want to do now is start to pull some of the slides together and say, well, what would action look like on climate change if we were to sort of respond to it as an emergency? And I'm going to use this one sort of equation here, that Paris plus the IPCC, or indeed G7 plus the IPCC, even more so, equals equity. And this is not a political position. It's not a moral position. It's simply a maths position. We have left it so late that now, in fact, equity, I would say, is key to us addressing climate change in relation to 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade, simply because of the maths. I mean, there are good moral arguments for it as well, but just thinking it from the maths. CO2 is highly skewed towards the relative few in our society. This is quite a well-known curve from Chancellor Piketty, or it's interpreted from Chancellor Piketty's work back in 2015, but it's been replicated by many people since, and most recently by Sivan Kartha and in the Stockholm Environment Institute, with a really interesting sort of analysis on this. And we know that about half of the global emissions come from 10% of the population, 70% from 20% of the population. But I think most damning, and this has come out of Sivan's work, the top 1% of global emitters emit twice as much carbon dioxide as the bottom 50%. And when I was at the House of Commons event today, I pointed out, of course, that virtually all of us in that event were in that top 1%. So it's not some other strange people out there. It's often people that we're engaging with on climate change. And it's easy to sort of think, well, can that really matter? Does it matter? A few wealthy people out there, relatively high emissions? Well, it does. And actually, I think a quick thought experiment, which I've been using for quite a few years, but it still holds, it's helpful here. If we were to treat climate change as an emergency and introduce regulations to require the top 10% of emitters to cut their carbon footprint to the level of the average European, and the other 90% of the global population make no change, then that's about a 1/3 cut in total CO2. And I think that really is very telling, that we can reduce our emissions by that much just by cutting the emissions of the top 10% to the level of the average European. It shows our emissions are hugely skewed to lifestyles that we've normalized, at least those of us in that top 10%. And of that 10% of global emitters, probably about 2/3 of them are in the OECD countries and 1/3 in the non-OECD countries. But it's certainly not everyone in our society. You know, the majority of people in the UK are below average UK emitters, of course, just by definition. So to conclude, the headline choice as I see it for developed nations, is that we can ignore international equity. We can pass a huge burden of climate change onto our children so that they become part of a 2.5 to 3 degrees C future, maybe even more than that. And in so doing, we renege on our Paris and our G7 commitments. But that does dovetail very nicely with today's politics. It allows us to maintain the economic market model and really have, at most, really incremental adjustments to business as usual. That's fine. That fits with a 5% mitigation rate and net zero by 2050. We just hope that I have to hope that our children will be understanding that we weren't prepared to commit to the Paris Agreement or G7. But if instead we say actually G7 and Paris are important and we want to take our international equity commitments seriously, then we require huge mitigation efforts by this generation to cut our emissions in line with well below 2 degrees centigrade. And if we can't manage that, at least 2 degrees, sorry, well below 1.5. And if we can't manage that, then at least 2 degrees. And that means abiding by our Paris commitments. But let's remind ourselves that these are not safe thresholds. So even the best that we can deliver now is going to bring about a lot of impacts around the world that we will have to seriously think about as well. But in doing this, we have to recognize that that's going to require a huge ramp up in government leadership and intervention. It's going to require profound reshaping of our economics. That I think is less of an issue. It should be less of an issue because we have had to do that anyway since, well, for 15 years or so, since the banking crisis and then with COVID. We've had 15 years of real major reshaping of our economics, of how we have used economics to respond and how we've used government powers to respond to the huge challenges that we've faced. And we also need, of course, immediate and deep cuts across all sectors, and that these need to embed equity within them. But that's something like a 10 to 20% per annum mitigation rate and real zero by 2035. So it's a very different story from the net zero and 5%. So delivering on G7 and Paris, I would argue, requires us to have a whole set of new narratives. We have to rethink, what do we mean by growth? Is it just GDP growth, or could it be growth in all sorts of other things, in the quality of our lives, in the environmental quality of our society, in the improvements in the air quality for people living in our cities? So that there are many, many ways we can measure growth as well as GDP. What do we consider to be progress? What do we consider to be development? How do we think about value? And I think particularly after coming out the back of COVID, when the whole this sort of discussion around key workers has led us to question how it is we value people in our society and the work that they put in to making our society a good place to live. So we need to think about values, think about how we reward success. We need a much better relationship with time, learning lessons from the past, and actually thinking about the impact of our actions in the future. We've become, I would suggest, we've become much more focused on the present, with not really taking some of the lessons from history, or not taking them seriously anyway, and not really thinking about the future, discounting the future. And that means to embed the whole concept of intergenerational equity, but I think also very importantly, intragenerational equity. Poor communities around the world are suffering the impacts of our warming today. So it's not as if it's just about future generations. The impacts of climate change are being felt around the planet now, and not just by these poor communities. Even in some of the wealthier parts of the world, we are starting to see some fairly large impacts that we are now fairly confident can be attributed to climate change, often exacerbating existing extreme weather conditions. And as one of my Swedish colleagues always points out, we need to have a much deeper appreciation of the more than human world. And that's one of the reasons I really warmed to the climate and ecological emergency bill, because it's an attempt there to bring back the separation of the climate from broader ecology. And I think bringing those together is really important. I think it's going to be very difficult, but we've spent 200 years developing very good ways of seeing society through a reductionist lens, of breaking the world up into disciplines, into sort of departments in universities, and seeing knowledge in those separate silos. But I think that has come, though that has been very successful, it has also come with big sort of system level implications that we have not been able to address. And I'm not actually sure we yet have the tools to address system level challenges, but we are trying hard, obviously, with climate change, with COVID and so forth. But I think we've been left wanting so far. So where are the catalysts for climate change? Where do they come from? Well, I would say they're not the catalysts for responding to climate change. They're not the usual suspects. they're not going to be the great and goods. They're not going to be, I don't think they're going to be sort of fantastic leaders or, old professors in universities and so forth. I think we need to look to different groups of people. I don't want to put the pressure on Greta's shoulders, but Greta catalyzed a youth movement that has been really important, and she wouldn't see herself in any way as a savior of climate change, but literally as a catalyst for wider action, for opening our eyes up, almost like the child that did say the emperors are wearing no clothes. So the school strikes, and these have occurred in the wealthy parts of the world, but actually this sort of youth movement is now spreading to many other parts of the world as well. Extinction Rebellion and other civil society movements are really interesting in that they have a much wider sort of uptake of people from society than we would traditionally have expected. And even things like flying shame, though I prefer to see it as flying consciousness. I think that's a probably better interpretation of the original Swedish term for it. I mean, these are making us question things that just a few years ago we wouldn't have questioned, we would have aspired to, in fact. So I think there's some interesting sort of shifts in the dynamics as these people have opened up a space for a dialogue, and a dialogue that many of my earlier career researchers are really welcoming. So I think there's almost like an opportunity for them to speak truth to power in the way that often, not all, but often I think some of the older academics are sort of locked into the current system and reluctant to step outside it and rock the boat too much. So what can we do as individuals? What's our role? Well, to me, I think what's most important is that we identify our carbon footprints and we try hard to reduce them. But that doesn't really matter. The reason it's important is that gives us an opportunity to talk about what we've tried to do and how we're doing it. Was it easy? Was it hard? Did it work? Did it not work? We should be honest about it. But we talk to it with our friends, our family. We don't bore them senseless, but it's hopefully a dialogue where we can start, whether it's in the pub or wherever it might be. And so it's a dialogue we can start. And it's a dialogue that's informed by us trying to do that ourselves. And we know from psychology research that if you try and do something yourself and then talk about it, people give your arguments much greater credibility. And we should engage in our universities, our places of work, our local council. So look at the local environment we're in, engage with people there, whether it's vice chancellors in universities, which is obviously an area that I know a little bit about, or whether it's our place of work or our local councillors or indeed our local MPs. Make our arguments and suggest what could be done as an alternative to what is being done. And I think, and I'll come back to this in a minute, if they're doing good things, also say that as well. But also I think engage nationally, engage with our MPs, but also with the relevant minister. So it's easy now, you can email them and you can just CC the minister about our concerns. Ask them why their actions don't meet their commitments, point them to other literatures and so forth. When they do something that's worthwhile and good, let them know, support them. We can also, of course, we don't have to just always email them directly. We can also engage with our local press. We can use social media. There are many ways now that we have voices that we didn't have before. As for COP, I've just put these slides, these sort of thoughts on as to what, to me, what signs of a COP that is in line with our with the climate emergency would have to look like. I think we'd have to say zero fossil fuel use in wealthy nations by 2035 to 40 at the very latest. And that's really more of a 2°C framing than 1.5. If it was 1.5, it would be 2030 to 2035 for wealthy nations. And there's be some difference between Poland and Portugal compared to, say, the US, the UK, or Germany. So there'll be some variations in the time frame there. And for poorer nations, they would have probably about 15 years grace. So 2045, 2050 to be zero emissions. I think there should be no substitution of real mitigation, actually reducing our emissions, for carbon dioxide removal. So fine, let's do some carbon dioxide, let's do the research in carbon dioxide removal, let's apply it where it works at scale and is sustainable. But let's not substitute our real mitigation for that. And we are already doing that in many parts of the world. It's embedded in virtually all models, this compensation between carbon dioxide removal and real mitigation. As I say here, let's make sure we do have a really well-funded program into looking at CDR, carbon dioxide removal. We should see climate change as just one of a suite of ecological challenges. So we really need to bring the sort of COP26 on climate change together with the COP15 on biodiversity. So those sorts of major international events need to come together to think about a more collective systems view. We require huge financial transfers from the poor nations, from the wealthy nations, sorry, to the poor nations to help them leapfrog the fossil fuel phase of life, of development. And this is not aid, it's reparation. Not only have we imposed impacts of climate change knowingly on them, But of course, we're asking them not to use the fossil fuels that we used to help us develop. So I think we have to really recognize this is not about aid. It is actually its due, just deserves for the poorer parts of the world. We need strict control on the other greenhouse gases as well as the CO2, so the non-CO2 greenhouse gases. And I think that's a more complicated issue than it is with carbon dioxide. And right across the pitch, whether that's in between countries or within countries, we need to embed equity and fairness as a key element of mitigation. And so far, that has been the elephant in the room. It's just simply not talked about. And I think primarily because the people who are engaged in climate change and setting the agenda have been the relatively wealthy in our society, and we're almost always within that group. So I think we have to have the courage to bring equity back out because the maths requires it. We also, I think, we can engage with our national policymakers. What should we be doing in the UK? And this can be outside of COP or in the run up to COP, and indeed after COP, because COP's by no means the last word in this. We need an immediate moratorium in the UK on all new fossil fuel developments, a moratorium on airport expansion, phase out of fossil fuel production by 2035, but with a just transition. We really need to think about the people that work in these industries and not do what we did with the coal industry, leaving communities decimated for decades to come. Introduce, as we were supposed to have done in 2016, but actually bring in legislation so that all new buildings have to be to a passive house standard with on-site renewables from 2022, without exception. A major retrofit agenda on all existing buildings that are going to remain in use for a long period of time. That's going to be really quite important if we're going to provide some new forms of heating to existing infrastructures. Move away from cars in our cities and dense urban environments, and I mean including that EVs. I personally, and I've written about this with colleagues, don't think EVs and a charging infrastructure within urban environments is a good solution to, or good response to climate change. That's not to say EVs haven't got a role in the rural environment. They certainly will have in the periphery of our cities where we can maybe pick up vehicles and rent them for longer journeys. That's fine. But the idea that we can travel around in EVs, I think, is barely a shift from traveling around in internal combustion engine cars. Facilitate a major shift to public and virtual transport, a frequent flyer levy to stop the frequent flyers, and still permit occasional trips by families flying on holiday or to meet other members of their family elsewhere in the world. No new fossil fuel power stations. I mean, it almost goes without saying, but we shouldn't be doing that. But of course, we are already looking at pursuing more gas-fired power stations, and a massive program of electrification. So here's a 10-point plan, which is fundamentally different to the 10-point plan that was put forward a few months ago by the Prime Minister. So electrification, probably 2 to 3 times our current level of electrification, which is 20%, 3 to 4 times our current electrification, which is about 20% of our energy demand in the UK. And that needs to be delivered in around about 20 years. In 2021, climate change has become system change. As Einstein noted, or this is attributed to him, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And thus far, we have chosen to pass on to our own children the consequences of 30 years of such insanity. And the CE bill, the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill, the forthcoming COP, these all give us a chance to stand up, recognize our failures in recent decades, but actually then say, well, okay, what is the action we need to put in place, and have a fundamental change in the debate and the scale of action that is now called for. So on that note, thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Kevin. Fascinating stuff as ever. Meg, would you like to pluck from one of the many questions from the audience to ask Kevin first?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you everyone for getting involved with all the questions, and we'll try and get through a couple of them. I'll start with one from Les, who says, Kim Stanley Robinson's brilliant and hopeful book, Ministry for the Future, paints a picture of doing all these things, but also initiating more radical economic and social shifts and even direct action against the rich and powerful. What do the panel think?
I think you're the panel, Kevin.
Am I in the panel as well?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I would agree. We have to find ways to address issues of power. I think absolutely at the heart of where we are and why we've failed are issues of power. And in addition to the book that was referred to then, actually, I haven't read the whole book, but I've read some of it. It's a good read. Myself and a colleague had a paper published recently, which is about to come out in open access form. Currently it's behind a paywall, and that actually looks at issues of power as well. It didn't start off looking at issues of power. It looked at 9 different lenses of why we haven't bent the emissions curve, and what came out really clearly actually it's power is at the heart of why, or the unfair distribution of power at the heart of why it is we have failed to address the climate challenge.
Thank you. Let me move on to a somewhat related question. Do you see a democratic defect or deficit emerging as global political leaders make grand pledges about cutting carbon without securing a democratic mandate for the implied lifestyle changes?
Well, actually, I think that misunderstands the challenge we face. I think there's a really clear democratic mandate, but we have to be more honest about the inequity in our society. For most people in saying, look at the UK, for example, for most people in the UK, responding to climate change is a really positive move. That means we can eliminate 10 to 20% of houses that fuel poverty. We can improve public transport. We improve the air quality in our cities. We have a massive jobs agenda for retrofit. So no longer we are on zero hours contracts doing call center work. We're now actually training people. So actually they can retrofit our properties. They can help electrify our system. There's a huge requirement to shift our physical infrastructure within sort of 20 years. That's a massive high quality jobs agenda. Now that's probably for what, 50, 60, 70% of the population. The problem is 30% of the population are responsible for the lion's share of emissions. The profound lifestyle changes are amongst us, but we are although we're quite a large number of us, we are the minority. The problem, we are the climate scientists and academics, we're the barristers, the policymakers, the business leaders, and the journalists. We are the people that frame the agenda. So far, frame the agenda. And I think that is the big problem. The democratic mandate is being misused as a reason for not having action. Because if we actually had action on climate change, most people would do, at almost every single level, would do much better out of that than the status quo. The problem is the few of us that are responsible for most of the emissions like the status quo, because we've done very well out of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Meg?
Hi, sorry, just scrolling through the multiple questions. If you've got one, Anthony, go ahead.
There's one that's, I suppose, a follow on again. Why all the focus on youth movements? The people who need to be making the changes are all grown up. We can't wait for the kids to grow up and be powerful.
I don't think we have a complete focus on youth movements. Extinction Rebellion probably has an average age which is probably nearer mine, I think. So I'm not sure we should have a separation between youth movements and older movements. They all, in the end, they all inform each other. But I think what's interesting with the youth movements, they obviously have a greater stake in the future, just almost just by definition, let's say. And I think that their voices have been therefore important in helping other generations catalyze or help catalyze concern amongst other generations. So in the end, it's not one generation versus another. It's about us coming together. But I think the youth have a different outlook that has helped the rest of us see the world and see the challenges we face, perhaps with more honesty and openness.
And do you see that as the best way to shift the power? How do you see that power shifting?
Well, this is what we tried to discuss in the paper, really. I think these different movements, not just the youth movements, but I think civil society movements that we've had so far on climate change have really opened up space for a dialogue that we didn't have before. The whole language of climate emergency, and even 1.5, has come out of a much wider group of civil society actors pushing the agenda. I think at the moment, the professionals, the experts, have not really engaged sufficiently with them. We're happy to engage with the BPs and Shells, the CEOs, the Davos set. We haven't yet, I think, by and large, had the courage to engage as fruitfully with some of these, if you like, bottom-up civil society movements. And I see us, in a sense, the experts, as we call them in the paper, we call them the enablers. They can enable either. They can enable the status quo by supporting Davos, which is what we've done so far, and that sort of existing economic model that we have. Or we could, alternatively, we could look at what some of the things that are coming out of the civil society movements and say, well, actually, are there ways that we can we can be guided by their thinking, and what would that look like? And I think we can enable a vision that comes from that than one that actually comes out of Davos, if you like, which is another one of the power clusters that we had, the sort of the Davos set, who are the voice of the status quo, if you like. So I think there is scope there for this coming together partnership between those of us who work in detail on climate change, the academic community, some in the NGO community as well, and other consultancies and so forth, with actually more the voices that are coming out of civil society. And I think that also lends, again, that back to the earlier question, I think to some extent that has much greater democratic mandate than just supporting the status quo that's been structured and laid out by relatively few people in our society.
Thank you, Kevin. We could have a very long and enjoyable conversation, but we're running out of time, I'm afraid. It's been fascinating. Thank you so much.
That's a pleasure.
We have had a request. I forget what you said about the paper that you've just been referring to. Is that already out or coming soon?
It is out. And I'll tell you what, I'll dig up the details and try and put it into the chat. How about that?
Yeah, that was the request. If you could do that, that'd be
okay. I'll do my best now then.
Thank you, Kevin. And so just in the last few minutes, we'd just like to introduce you to our Zero Carbon Britain Hub and Innovation Lab team, and just say a few words on that to tell people about how we're going about supporting climate emergency declaration action at local level in local authorities. You'll be able to find out more through the link that I've just posted in the chat. I'll tell you a little bit first. My name's Anthony Herford. I'm the project manager of the Hub and Innovation Lab. I think I forgot to say that at the outset due to time pressures. I've been responsible for developing a resource hub. We've got over 200 and counting resources useful there for inspiring and informing action on climate emergency declarations there. Do keep having a look back there for the expanding range of resources that we've got, and that's available at the link just posted in the chat. We've been doing a series of webinars with Ashton, all about tried and tested solutions for a green recovery, and those highlighting replicable ways to reduce emissions at local level. And there's recordings of those through our website. We're running weekly Q&A sessions if you want to find out more about our research on Zero Carbon Britain or project activities. We're supporting community groups who are working at county scale to share their experience and learning about how to take action on climate change. All these events available through our website, cat.org.uk/ZCB. I'll hand you over now to our training manager, Amanda Smith, to tell you a little bit about what we're doing in that realm.
Evening, everybody. So we're developing and delivering a range of training courses as well as a menu of bespoke training options. All our training is designed as tools really to provide councils, communities and other organisations with the knowledge, that all important confidence and the skills to help net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2040. We're working with all sorts of groups, local community groups, community energy groups, and most recently the British Retail Consortium. Our general course is a 2-day Zero Carbon Britain training, and that's regularly attended by people who want a deep understanding of our rigorously researched endpoint vision for a net zero society. It's highly interactive, although it's digital, it's as close to an in-person experience as possible. Lots of opportunities to share ideas. The next one's running 17th, 18th of November. We're developing 1-day courses on the themes of our Zero Carbon Britain report. We've already developed and run an energy one. We'll have new dates for that shortly, and building and retrofit will be coming next. Any of our training we can do is bespoke, from 1 hour to a series of workshops. As you can see, we're a really small team, and the train the trainer offer is integral to what we do. We're delighted to be part of the Carbon Literacy Project community for this. We're delivering carbon literacy with a Zero Carbon Britain flavour. Our next course is sold out, but we're about to release new dates through December and January. I just want to really finish by saying the thing that makes our training unique is that it's informed directly by the findings of our innovation labs, and Anna Bullen will be telling you about that in a moment. It also includes content from our Zero Carbon Britain research and reports, and we have a dedicated knowledge and outreach officer who makes sure that our content is bang up to date. Everything's delivered digitally at the moment, but we really hope to be able to delivering some training face to face very soon. So I can hand over to Anna Bullen now, who's our Innovation Lab Manager. She can tell you a little bit more about that side of our work.
Thanks, Amanda. Hi, everyone. I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to tell you very quickly about the Innovation Lab. So the Innovation Lab, as Amanda said, sits very neatly alongside the training and the resource hub, builds on the legacy of our Zero Carbon Britain research. The idea of the Innovation Lab is really to identify the key barriers to getting to net zero, then to bring together kind of the key stakeholders, broad range of stakeholders relevant to that issue, that barrier, and work with them to understand and explore those barriers, to co-design solutions or interventions to those barriers, and then support the implementation of them. That's a very, very kind of broad overview of it. The work we've been doing to date over the last 18 months, we've been running quite a long-term lab in Staffordshire with the 10 key councils across Staffordshire, exploring how they can work better together to address the climate emergency. And we've just come up with, based on that process, a set of recommendations. We also ran a lab earlier this year in Shropshire, looking at how the Shropshire Climate Action Partnership can better engage businesses. And that we hope to build on that work and broaden that out a bit. And then come this autumn, the next lab we've got coming up is a land use lab. Kevin touched on it in his talk, responsible for approximately 20 to 24% of our emissions. So hugely important sector. And for that one, we're really looking at land use as a whole. We're not separating out agriculture. We're looking at agriculture, at forestry, at peatlands. We're looking at all the land sectors together to see how together they can address the climate emergency. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. If anyone wants to get in touch with us, we're at zcb@cat.org.uk on anything you've heard here. I'll just post that in the chat for reference. And yeah, I'd just like to very much thank Kevin again for coming along and giving such a fascinating talk, building on all his extensive experience and inside knowledge of time in the Commons just today. So thank you, Kevin, and thank you to everyone for attending and providing such stimulating questions and responding to each other. It's been a great session. Thank you very much.